collision course for death out there and not caring. I think that if I would have never came to death row, I wouldn't be the individual I am today. I wouldn't be as mature. I wouldn't be able to explain to my daughter's life, like the appreciation of it, because I didn't have any appreciation for life. I wouldn't be able to explain to them that there's a world out there. And
How does a 34-year-old man feel knowing he has less than 24 hours to live? Not because of illness, not because of war, but because the state of Texas has marked the date and time they plan to kill him. Christopher Young lies awake in his prison cell on the night of July 16, 2018, staring at the ceiling, replaying every mistake he's ever made. Cell 12, Building F, Polunsky Unit, Texas's death row. He's been here for 4,148 days. Tomorrow will be his last. He's not the angry 21-year-old who took Hasmukh Patel's life. Not the gang member who terrorized women in front of their children. Not the addict who chose violence over reason on a Sunday morning in 2004. For over a decade, he's been a model prisoner, mentoring other inmates, rejecting violence, finding religion, finding peace. But none of that matters now. The countdown has begun. At 6:00 p.m. tomorrow, Christopher Young will walk 97 steps from his cell to the execution chamber in Huntsville. He will be strapped to a gurney, given a chance to say his final words, and then injected with a cocktail of chemicals designed to stop his heart. He will become the 555th person executed by the state of Texas since they resumed capital punishment in 1982. The irony isn't lost on anyone paying attention. Just 7 months ago, another man sat in a similar cell facing similar circumstances. Thomas Bartlett Whitaker had orchestrated the murder of his entire family, shooting his mother and brother dead, nearly killing his father who survived to testify on his behalf, but Thomas Whitaker was white. And Thomas Whitaker received clemency. Christopher Young's case has divided communities, sparked protests, and raised questions that go to the heart of American justice. His supporters argue that his story proves what many have long suspected, that justice in America isn't colorblind, that a black man who commits murder faces different consequences than a white man who commits the same crime or worse. But Christopher's critics see something else entirely. They see a man who spent years perfecting the art of manipulation, a predator who learned to speak the language of redemption, while never truly confronting the monster he had been. They point to his crimes, not just murder, but sexual assault, terrorizing children, a pattern of violence that stretches back to his childhood. Tonight, in the suffocating silence of death row, Christopher holds a photograph of his 3 daughters, 17, 13, and 13, twin girls who were barely walking when their father was condemned to die. They've only known him through prison glass and monitored phone calls. Tomorrow they will visit him for the last time to say goodbye. In a few hours, these girls will become orphans, not because their father died of natural causes or tragic accident, but because of choices he made on November 21, 2004. They will join the ranks of Hasmukh Patel's children, who also lost their father to Christopher Young's violence. The cycle of pain, extending across generations. Christopher's cell is 6 feet by 10 feet. A steel toilet, a thin mattress on a concrete slab, harsh fluorescent lighting that never fully dims. For 13 years, this has been his entire world. He's memorized every crack in the walls, counted every tile on the floor. He knows the sound of every guard's footstep, the routine of every shift change. Death row is a place where time moves differently, where years stretch into decades, but final days compress into heartbeats, where men discover who they really are when everything else is stripped away. Some find God, some find peace, some find only the echo of their victims' screams. Christopher Young claims he found redemption. Letters from around the world support this claim. From death penalty opponents, religious groups, people who believe in second chances. They point to his work mentoring younger inmates, his role in de-escalating prison violence, his pursuit of education behind bars. But redemption is a luxury, that victims' families rarely get to experience. Hasmukh Patel's wife never got to see her husband grow old. His children never got the chance to introduce their father to his grandchildren. The 3 little girls who witnessed their mother's sexual assault at Christopher's hands carry trauma that no amount of his claimed transformation can heal. Outside the prison walls tonight, a small group of protesters hold candles and signs, some calling for mercy, others demanding justice. The debate that has raged for months will end tomorrow evening, but the questions it raises about race, redemption, and the death penalty will linger long after Christopher Young is gone. The evidence against Christopher was overwhelming. Surveillance footage capturing the murder, witness testimony, his own confession, physical evidence linking him to not one but multiple crimes committed in a 3-hour span that Sunday morning. The jury took just 2 hours to sentence him to death. What they saw wasn't just a murder. It was the culmination of a lifetime of escalating violence. A man who had assaulted his own mother as a juvenile, who had beaten his pregnant girlfriend so severely she lied about going into labor just to make him stop, who had sexually assaulted a woman in front of her 3 young daughters before driving to a convenience store and executing the shopkeeper for no apparent reason. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a pattern of predatory behavior that found its inevitable conclusion in Hasmukh Patel's blood. Yet Christopher Young's transformation in prison appears genuine to many who have observed him over the years. Guards speak of his calm demeanor. Fellow inmates describe his mentorship. Prison officials note his complete lack of disciplinary infractions. If a man can truly change, they argue, Christopher Young has proven it's possible. But Texas has never been a state that rewards transformation over punishment. The Lone Star State leads the nation in executions, and its courts have consistently held that redemption doesn't erase the crimes that came before it. The law is clear. Some actions are unforgivable no matter who you become afterward. As dawn approaches on July 17, 2018, Christopher Young faces the final hours of his life. He will eat his last meal. Not a special request, but whatever the prison serves. He will meet with his spiritual advisor. He will see his daughters one final time through reinforced glass. And then he will make that walk to Huntsville, where justice, or vengeance, depending on your perspective, will finally be served. To understand why Christopher Young must die, we must go back to the beginning. Back to the gifted child who could play violin by ear, who mastered chess before he could properly read. Back to the trauma that shattered his world at age 8. Back to the choices that turned a brilliant boy into a condemned man. This is the story of Christopher Young's last 24 hours. But more than that, it's the story of how 3 hours of violence on a November morning earned him a lifetime in a cage, and how transformation came too late to save him. The clock is ticking, and tomorrow, it stops forever. Christopher Anthony Young wasn't born a killer. He wasn't born with violence in his DNA or evil in his heart. He was born on March 15, 1984 in San Antonio, Texas, to a teenage mother who loved him fiercely and saw nothing but possibility in her baby boy's eyes. The early signs were remarkable. By age 4, Christopher could hear a melody once and reproduce it perfectly on any instrument he touched. Piano, violin, cello, bass, it didn't matter. Music seemed to flow through him like water. His elementary school teachers called him gifted, possibly genius level. He played chess with the strategic mind of someone 3 times his age, moving pieces with the confidence of a grandmaster. His mother, Patricia Young, worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table and clothes on Christopher's back. She dreamed of music lessons, chess tournaments, maybe even college scholarships. She saw her son's potential and believed with every fiber of her being that he could rise above their circumstances in East San Antonio. That boy had music in his soul, Patricia would later tell the court. He could make any instrument sing. He was special. He was my miracle. But miracles are fragile things in neighborhoods where gunshots punctuate the night and sirens provide the soundtrack to childhood. Christopher's brilliance needed nurturing, protection, guidance. What he got instead was trauma that would shatter his world and redirect the course of his life forever. Christopher was 8 years old when his father, Anthony Young Sr., was shot and killed in a street murder that was never solved. The details were murky: a drug deal gone wrong, a gang dispute, retaliation for some perceived slight. It didn't matter. What mattered was that one moment Christopher had a father who taught him chess moves and encouraged his music, and the next moment he had nothing but questions no one could answer. Why did they kill my daddy? Christopher asked his mother over and over in the weeks that followed. What did he do wrong? Patricia Young had no answers. She was 19 years old, suddenly a single mother, grieving her own loss while trying to help her son make sense of something senseless. The family spiraled. Bills went unpaid. The music lessons stopped. The chess tournaments were forgotten. Survival became the only priority. But Christopher's trauma was just beginning. His mother, desperate for stability and support, remarried quickly. The new stepfather brought new horrors into their home. While Christopher was struggling to process his father's violent death, his older sister was being sexually abused by the man who was supposed to protect their family. When she became pregnant by her stepfather at just 13 years old, the family's dysfunction reached a breaking point that would echo through generations. Christopher watched his sister's childhood end in the most brutal way possible. He saw his mother's attempts to hold the family together crumble under the weight of secrets and shame. The boy who had once found solace in music and strategy now found only chaos and pain wherever he looked. Child psychology experts would later explain what happens when a young mind experiences this level of trauma without intervention. The developing brain, unable to process such overwhelming pain, begins to rewire itself for survival. Trust disappears. Empathy becomes a luxury the psyche can't afford. Violence starts to seem not just normal, but necessary. Christopher never received counseling after his father's murder. Never got therapy to help him understand his sister's abuse. Never had a male role model to show him what healthy masculinity looked like. Instead, he was left to navigate his pain alone. An 8-year-old boy trying to make sense of a world that had shown him nothing but cruelty. The neighborhood filled the vacuum where family support should have been. By age 10, Christopher was spending more time on the streets than at home. The older boys who ran corners and claimed territory became his teachers. They taught him that respect comes from fear, that showing weakness gets you killed, that the only way to protect yourself is to become more dangerous than everyone around you. The Bloods gang recruited Christopher before he even understood what he was joining. To a traumatized child, desperate for belonging, the red bandanas and street codes offered something his broken family couldn't: identity, purpose, protection. The boy who had once moved chess pieces with precision now learned to move through gang territories with the same strategic thinking, but applied to survival instead of sport. His teachers watched the transformation with heartbreak and frustration. The brilliant child who had once eagerly raised his hand in class became sullen and withdrawn. The boy who had played violin with such natural talent stopped showing up for music programs. The chess prodigy who had beaten high school students when he was in elementary school lost interest in any game that didn't involve real stakes. "We lost Christopher piece by piece," one of his elementary school teachers would later recall. Every time he came back from a suspension or an absence, a little more of that bright light in his eyes was gone. We tried to reach him, but the streets were louder than we were. By age 12, Christopher Young was a full member of the Bloods. The violin had been replaced by weapons. Chess moves had become street moves. The gifted child had disappeared entirely, swallowed by a young man who believed violence was the only language the world understood. Patricia Young watched her son's transformation with growing desperation. She tried moving the family to different neighborhoods, enrolling him in different schools, even sending him to live with relatives in other cities. But Christopher always found his way back to the gang, back to the streets, back to the only family structure that seemed to accept him as he was. The arrests began early: petty theft at 13, drug possession at 14, assault charges before he turned 15. Each time Christopher found himself in juvenile detention, officials saw the same thing: a young man with obvious intelligence being wasted on increasingly serious crimes. They offered programs, counseling, Educational opportunities. Christopher participated when required, but his heart wasn't in reform. His heart was back on the streets with the only brothers he had left. What none of them understood was that Christopher Young wasn't choosing gang life over legitimate opportunities. To him, there were no legitimate opportunities. The world had killed his father, destroyed his family, and taught him that the only way to survive was to be harder, meaner, more ruthless than everyone else. By the time Christopher turned 18 and aged out of the juvenile system, he was no longer the musical prodigy who had once held so much promise. He was a hardened gang member with a growing reputation for violence and an increasing willingness to use it. The transformation was complete. The boy was gone. What remained would terrorize San Antonio for years to come. The seeds of November 21, 2004 were planted in the soil of childhood trauma and watered with neglect, violence, and the absence of anyone who could show Christopher Young a different way to be a man. His brilliance had been weaponized, his pain had been turned outward, and the clock was ticking toward the day when his victims would pay the price for a broken system that had failed a broken child. Understanding Christopher Young's execution requires understanding this fundamental truth. November 21, 2004 wasn't the first time he chose violence. It wasn't even the 10th time. By his 21st birthday, Christopher had established a pattern of escalating brutality that would make his final crime seem less like an aberration and more like an inevitable destination. The juvenile records paint a disturbing picture. Theft, drug possession, assault, charges that accumulated like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. But it was the nature of his victims that revealed the true darkness growing inside Christopher Young. He didn't just commit crimes. He specifically targeted the most vulnerable people in his world. The first recorded assault was against his own mother, Patricia Young, when Christopher was just 16 years old. Court documents describe a domestic violence incident where Christopher struck his mother during an argument over money. She called police, had him arrested, then dropped the charges, a cycle that would repeat itself with devastating consequences. "I thought it was just teenage anger," Patricia would later tell investigators. "I thought he would grow out of it. I thought I could handle it myself. I was wrong about everything." The second assault against his mother happened 8 months later. This time, Christopher didn't just hit Patricia Young. He beat her badly enough to require medical attention. Hospital records show bruises on her arms, back, and face, a split lip, a black eye that took weeks to heal. When asked by nurses what happened, Patricia claimed she fell downstairs. But the police report tells a different story. Neighbors had called 911 after hearing screaming and the sound of furniture breaking. When officers arrived, they found Patricia Young sobbing in her kitchen while Christopher sat calmly in the living room, showing no remorse for what he had done. The defendant displayed a concerning lack of emotional response to his mother's injuries, the arresting officer wrote in his report. When asked why he had struck his mother, he replied that she needed to learn respect. This wasn't teenage rebellion. This wasn't normal adolescent acting out. This was a young man who had learned to use violence as a tool of control, starting with the woman who had given him life. Criminal psychologists would later identify this pattern as a key predictor of future domestic violence and sexual assault. Men who abuse their mothers, they explained, often view all women as targets for their rage. Christopher's violence wasn't limited to his family. His juvenile record includes charges for assault against a teacher, fighting with school security, and threatening other students with weapons. Each incident followed the same pattern: explosive anger, disproportionate violence, and complete absence of remorse. By age 18, Christopher Young had become exactly what trauma experts feared: a young man who viewed violence not as a last resort, but as a first option. The streets had taught him that respect comes from fear, and he had internalized that lesson completely. His adult criminal record began almost immediately after his 18th birthday. Possession of marijuana in March 2002. Evading arrest in July 2002. But it was the assault charges that revealed the man Christopher was becoming, someone who specifically targeted women and used violence to maintain control over them. The pattern accelerated when Christopher began his relationship with Chala Riley in 2003. Chala was 19, working as a home health aide, trying to build a stable life for herself. She was attracted to Christopher's intelligence, his musical abilities, his capacity for charm when he chose to use it. What she didn't see until it was too late was the rage simmering just beneath the surface. Their relationship began as a typical romance. Christopher could be thoughtful, even romantic. He would play music for Chala, talk about his dreams of getting out of gang life, promise her a future together. But those moments of tenderness were interspersed with increasing episodes of jealousy, control, and violence. The first time Christopher hit Chala, she was 4 months pregnant with their first child. The argument started over something trivial. She had spoken to another man at the grocery store. Christopher's response was swift and brutal. He slapped her across the face, then grabbed her by the throat and pushed her against the wall. "You don't talk to other men," he told her, his grip tightening around her neck. "You belong to me. You and that baby belong to me." Chala was terrified, not just for herself, but for the life growing inside her. She apologized, promised it would never happen again, did everything she could to de-escalate the situation. It was a pattern that would define their relationship for the next 1.5 years. Christopher's violence toward Chala escalated throughout her pregnancy. He controlled where she went, who she spoke to, what she wore. When she tried to visit friends, he accused her of cheating. When she worked late, he accused her of lying. When she didn't answer his calls immediately, he showed up at her workplace demanding explanations. "He changed completely once I got pregnant," Chala would later testify. "It was like he thought he owned me, like I was his property instead of his girlfriend." The abuse reached a horrifying peak in September 2004, when Chala was 8 months pregnant with their second child. The couple had been arguing about money. Christopher wanted her to ask her family for cash to support his drug habits. When Chala refused, Christopher exploded. Court records describe the assault in clinical detail. Christopher punched Chala in the face, giving her a black eye and split lip. When she tried to protect her pregnant belly, he grabbed her by the hair and threw her to the ground. As she lay there, 8 months pregnant and bleeding, Christopher kicked her in the ribs and threatened to kill both her and the unborn baby if she ever disobeyed him again. "I was sure he was going to kill us both," Chala testified. "The only reason he stopped was because I lied and told him I was going into labor. Even then, he made me promise not to call the police before he would let me go to the hospital." Chala spent 2 days in the hospital being monitored for premature labor and internal bleeding. When doctors asked about her injuries, she claimed she had fallen downstairs, the same lie Christopher's mother had told years earlier. The cycle of violence and silence continued. But Christopher's pattern of abuse extended beyond his immediate family. In May 2004, 6 months before the murders, Christopher shot at another man in a parking lot dispute. Witnesses described a minor argument over a parking space that escalated when Christopher pulled out a handgun and fired multiple rounds at the other driver. Miraculously, no one was hit. But the incident revealed Christopher's willingness to use deadly violence over trivial provocations. No charges were ever filed in that shooting, a failure of the system that would have tragic consequences. If Christopher had been arrested and prosecuted for attempted murder in May 2004, he would have been in jail on November 21st instead of free to commit the crimes that would seal his fate. Criminal justice experts point to Christopher's case as a textbook example of escalating domestic violence. The pattern is always the same. It starts with emotional abuse, escalates to physical violence against intimate partners, then eventually spills over into violence against strangers. By the time offenders like Christopher Young reach the point of committing stranger murders, they've typically left a trail of battered women and terrorized family members in their wake. Christopher Young didn't suddenly become violent on November 21, 2004, explained Dr. Sarah Martinez, a forensic psychologist who studied the case. He had been practicing violence against women for years. What happened that day was simply the culmination of a pattern that had been building since adolescence. The most disturbing aspect of Christopher's pattern was his complete lack of remorse. In every police report, every witness statement, every court document, the same detail appears. Christopher showed no emotion when confronted with the consequences of his violence. No guilt, no shame, no recognition that he had done anything wrong. When arrested for assaulting his mother, he complained that the handcuffs were too tight. When charged with beating his pregnant girlfriend, he asked when he could make bail. When witnesses described his parking lot shooting, he denied it had happened despite multiple eyewitness accounts. This wasn't just criminal behavior. This was the psychology of a predator, someone who viewed other people not as human beings deserving of respect and dignity, but as objects to be controlled, dominated, and discarded when they were no longer useful. By November 2004, Christopher Young had assaulted his mother twice, beaten his pregnant girlfriend repeatedly, shot at a stranger in a parking lot, and been in and out of the juvenile and adult criminal justice systems for years. He was 20 years old and had already established himself as one of San Antonio's most dangerous young men. The pattern was clear. The warning signs were everywhere. The system had multiple opportunities to intervene, to recognize the escalating danger Christopher posed to the community, particularly to women and children. Instead, he remained free to commit the crimes that would finally, definitively, reveal the monster he had become. November 20th, 2004, would be Christopher Young's final night as a free man. The next day, his pattern of violence would reach its inevitable, horrifying conclusion. November 20th, 2004. The last night Christopher Young would spend as a free man, though he didn't know it yet. By morning, his escalating pattern of violence would finally reach its inevitable, horrific conclusion. But that night, he was just another angry young man drowning his rage in alcohol and drugs, with no idea that the next 24 hours would end 3 lives and destroy countless others. The evening began like so many others in Christopher's chaotic existence. He was angry at the world, at his circumstances, at anyone who had more than he did or seemed happier than he felt. His relationship with his pregnant girlfriend Chala Riley had been deteriorating for months after their violent confrontation in September, when he had beaten her so severely while she was 8 months pregnant that she lied about going into labor just to make him stop. Since then, Chala had been keeping her distance, trying to protect herself and their children from Christopher's increasingly unpredictable moods. She was afraid of him, terrified really, and Christopher could sense her pulling away. To a man who viewed women as his property, this felt like the ultimate betrayal. But November 20th wasn't about Chala specifically. It was about Christopher's general state of mind, a toxic combination of narcissistic rage, gang mentality, and complete lack of empathy that had been building since childhood. He felt wronged by everyone and everything, convinced that the world owed him something he wasn't getting. Christopher spent that Saturday night bar hopping on San Antonio's east side, moving from one establishment to another, drinking heavily and smoking marijuana. Court records show that over the course of the evening, he consumed between 15 and 20 beers, enough alcohol to severely impair judgment in any normal person. But for Christopher, it simply removed whatever thin layer of self-control he still possessed. The bars Christopher frequented weren't upscale establishments. They were the kind of places where violence was always simmering just beneath the surface, where arguments could escalate to gunshots in seconds, where predators went to find victims, and victims went hoping to avoid predators. Christopher fit right in. As the night wore on, Christopher's drinking became more aggressive, his mood darker. Other patrons remember him talking loudly about respect, about people not knowing who they were dealing with, about making someone pay. The specific words varied depending on who was listening, but the underlying message was always the same. Christopher Young was looking for trouble. Around 2 a.m., Christopher acquired the silver revolver that would become his murder weapon. The details of this transaction remain unclear. Street gun sales rarely leave paper trails, but witnesses later confirmed seeing Christopher with the weapon, checking the chamber, discussing its capabilities with obvious familiarity. By 4 a.m., most of the bars had closed, But Christopher wasn't ready to go home. Home meant facing the reality of his failures, his criminal record, his deteriorating relationships, his complete lack of prospects for legitimate success. Instead, he continued the party at an after-hours club, adding crack cocaine to his chemical cocktail. The crack cocaine was the final ingredient in Christopher's toxic mix. If the alcohol had lowered his inhibitions and the marijuana had dulled his conscience, the crack made him feel invincible, paranoid, and utterly disconnected from normal human emotion. Combined with his existing anger issues and history of violence, the drugs transformed Christopher from a dangerous man into a ticking time bomb. Criminal psychologists would later analyze Christopher's state of mind that night and conclude that he had entered what they call a dissociative episode, a condition where someone becomes so disconnected from reality that they can commit horrific acts without fully processing what they're doing. It's not an excuse for violence, but it helps explain how someone can escalate from petty crime to sexual assault and murder in a matter of hours. As dawn approached on November 21st, Christopher was still awake, still high, still drinking, and still carrying his loaded silver revolver. He had been up for nearly 24 hours, consuming massive quantities of alcohol and illegal drugs, stewing in his own rage and resentment. The sun rose over San Antonio at 7:23 a.m. that Sunday morning. Christopher Young watched it from the parking lot of a convenience store, smoking his last hit of crack cocaine and finishing his final beer. He was broke, exhausted, chemically altered beyond rational thought, and armed with a loaded gun. In his distorted mental state, Christopher had convinced himself that someone needed to pay for his misery. Someone needed to suffer because he was suffering. Someone needed to be punished because he felt punished by life itself. The fact that his victims would be complete strangers who had never wronged him didn't matter. In Christopher's mind, all of society was responsible for his pain. At 8:30 a.m., Christopher began driving through the residential neighborhoods of San Antonio's east side, looking for opportunity. He wasn't hunting for anything specific, just vulnerability, isolation, easy targets for his rage. The loaded revolver sat on the passenger seat next to him, ready for use. The neighborhoods Christopher drove through were working-class areas where people minded their own business and tried to stay out of trouble. Families getting ready for church, single mothers preparing breakfast for their children, elderly shopkeepers opening their stores for another day of honest work. None of them knew that a predator was cruising their streets high on drugs and armed for violence. At 8:45 a.m., Christopher Young spotted what he was looking for. A young woman had just returned to her efficiency apartment from a quick trip to buy cigarettes. Her 3 young daughters were visible through the window, eating breakfast at a small table. The apartment was isolated, the woman was alone with small children, and there were no witnesses in sight. Christopher parked on the street and checked his revolver one more time. The night of drinking and drug use had brought him to this moment, armed, angry, and completely detached from normal human decency. He walked toward Daphne Edwards' front door with no specific plan beyond causing pain. The final act of Christopher Young's criminal career was about to begin. In the next 3 hours, he would sexually assault a mother in front of her children, steal her car, murder an innocent shopkeeper, and set in motion the chain of events that would ultimately lead him to death row. The night before was over. The day of horror had begun. November 21st, 2004, 8:45 a.m. Daphne Edwards had just returned from buying cigarettes at a store 1 block away from her efficiency apartment on San Antonio's east side. The 23-year-old single mother was serving breakfast to her 3 young daughters, ages 8, 6, and 4, when there was a knock at her front door. Daphne thought it was her sister coming to visit. She opened the door without checking, expecting a familiar face and a normal Sunday morning conversation. Instead, she found herself staring at Christopher Young, a stranger with bloodshot eyes, reeking of alcohol and drugs, pointing a silver revolver directly at her head. "Where's the fucking money?" Christopher demanded, pushing his way into the small apartment before Daphne could react. The 3 little girls looked up from their breakfast, their spoons frozen halfway to their mouths, terror instantly replacing the innocent chatter that had filled the room moments before. Christopher waved the gun around the apartment, checking to make sure no one else was home, ensuring there were no phones within reach, establishing complete control over the situation. The children began to cry, not the normal tears of childhood disappointment, but the primal wailing of young minds confronted with incomprehensible horror. "Shut them up," Christopher ordered Daphne, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone who had used violence to control others for years. "Make them stop crying or I'll give them something to really cry about." Daphne tried to calm her daughters while simultaneously calculating her options. The apartment was small, an efficiency unit with no separate bedrooms, nowhere to hide, no escape routes. Christopher stood between her and the door. Her children were terrified and vulnerable. She had no choice but to comply with whatever this monster demanded. "Please," Daphne begged, her voice shaking. "Just take whatever you want and leave. Don't hurt my babies." Christopher walked through the apartment at gunpoint, forcing Daphne to show him that no one else was present, that there was no access to help. When he was satisfied that he had complete control, he made his first demand. "Give me all your money, now." Daphne handed him her purse, which contained $28, her entire weekly budget for groceries and necessities. She was a single mother working 2 jobs, barely keeping her family fed and housed. $28 represented a significant sacrifice, money she couldn't afford to lose. Christopher looked at the bills in disgust. "This ain't enough," he told her. "You gotta give me something else because this ain't enough money." That's when Daphne realized with growing horror that this wasn't just a robbery. Christopher's eyes had a predatory gleam that had nothing to do with money. He was looking at her the way a hunter looks at trapped prey. She understood, with the awful clarity that comes in life-threatening situations, exactly what he intended to do. "Please don't," she whispered, glancing at her daughters who were still seated at the breakfast table, watching everything with wide, terrified eyes. "Please don't do this in front of my children." Christopher's response was to fire a shot into the floor next to Daphne's feet. The sound in the small apartment was deafening, causing the children to scream and cover their ears. Plaster and debris flew across the room. The message was unmistakably clear. He would use the gun if she didn't comply with his demands. "Take your clothes off," Christopher ordered. Now, with her children watching and crying, Daphne began to undress. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely manage the buttons and zippers. Christopher grew impatient with her pace and threatened to shoot again if she didn't move faster. When Christopher told the children to go to the other room, Daphne's heart broke a little more. In an efficiency apartment, there was no other room, just the bathroom. The girls huddled together in the tiny space, but they could still see everything that was happening to their mother. They could hear every sound, every threat, every moment of her degradation. Christopher forced Daphne to sit in a chair and perform oral sex on him while her daughters watched from the bathroom doorway. The psychological torture was as calculated as it was cruel. He could have taken her somewhere private, but he chose to commit this assault in front of 3 innocent children who would carry the trauma for the rest of their lives. "Don't look away," he told the girls when they tried to turn their heads. "Watch what happens when people don't do what I tell them." After the initial assault, Christopher decided he wanted Daphne to wear something sexy for him. He made her get dressed again, critiquing her clothing choices, forcing her to change outfits multiple times while her children sobbed in the corner. The power and control were intoxicating to him. He was playing with his victims like a cat plays with mice. Christopher then forced Daphne into the bathroom, where the children couldn't see as clearly, but where he could still monitor them. He made her perform oral sex on him again, drawing out the assault not for physical pleasure but for the psychological satisfaction of complete domination. The sexual assault lasted nearly an hour. Christopher seemed to enjoy not just the physical acts he was forcing on Daphne, but the terror in her children's eyes, the sounds of their crying, the knowledge that he was destroying an entire family's sense of safety and innocence. When Christopher finally decided he was ready to leave, Daphne made a desperate plea. "Please just go," she begged. "Please just leave us alone now." But Christopher had other plans. "You're coming with me," he told her. "We're taking a ride." When Daphne protested that she couldn't leave her children, Christopher's response revealed the depth of his narcissistic cruelty. "You did it before," he said. "I saw you leave to go to the store." Christopher then walked over to each of the 3 terrified little girls and kissed them on the cheek, a gesture so grotesquely inappropriate that it seemed designed to maximize their psychological trauma. "Your mommy's gonna be back," he told them with mock gentleness. "Y'all be good while we're gone." Christopher forced Daphne, still at gunpoint, to leave the apartment and get into her red Mazda protege. He had her drive to the front of the apartment complex, then decided he wanted to drive himself. As he was getting out to switch seats, he made his position clear. "Don't drive off," he warned her, "or I'll go back and kill your children." But as Christopher walked around the car to get into the driver's seat, Daphne saw her chance. He had left the passenger door open, and she could see people in the parking lot. This might be her only opportunity to escape and get help for her children. Daphne bolted from the car, running and screaming across the parking lot toward her cousin's apartment at the front of the complex. Christopher, caught off guard by her sudden flight, made a split-second decision that would seal his fate. Instead of pursuing Daphne, he got behind the wheel of her Mazda and drove away. In those crucial seconds, Christopher Young had crossed the line from sexual assault and kidnapping to armed carjacking. He was now driving a stolen vehicle, armed with a loaded weapon, high on drugs, and drunk on the power he had just exercised over a helpless family. Christopher drove Daphne Edwards' red Mazda protege directly to Hasmukh Patel's mini-mart, arriving at exactly 9:37 a.m. The 55-year-old shopkeeper was working alone, as he did every Sunday morning, preparing for another day of serving his community through honest work. Hasmukh Patel was an immigrant who had come to America seeking the same thing millions before him had sought: safety, stability, and a better life for his family. He believed in hard work, in treating every customer with dignity, in building something meaningful through patience and perseverance. His small store was more than a business. It was his contribution to the American dream. The store's surveillance camera captured everything that happened next. Christopher entered wearing a black shirt and light-colored shorts, the same clothes witnesses had seen him wearing during the assault on Daphne Edwards. He appeared to be holding something hidden in his left pocket, the silver revolver that had terrorized the Edwards family less than an hour earlier. Christopher looked around the front of the store before moving behind Hasmukh Patel, who was working in the rear. The initial interaction seemed normal. Christopher asked about the cost of dry cleaning services, but within seconds his voice changed to the same menacing tone Daphne Edwards had heard at her front door. "All right, give up the money. I'm not playing. I'm not fucking playing." Hasmukh Patel, sensing the danger immediately, moved quickly behind the counter toward the cash register. He had survived violence in his homeland and recognized it when it came to his adopted country. But Christopher was already extending his left arm, pointing the silver handgun directly at the man who had never done him any harm. "Give up the money," Christopher ordered again, but Patel was already reaching for the panic button on the store's alarm system. The shopkeeper knew he was in mortal danger and was trying to summon help before it was too late. Christopher fired his first shot in Patel's direction. The sound echoed through the small store as the alarm began its piercing wail. Patel disappeared from view behind the counter, but Christopher wasn't finished. "You be fucking up, I'm not playing, give it up," Christopher shouted over the alarm, then fired his second shot at the fallen shopkeeper. At this point, the alarm was screaming and Christopher could see Patel trying to crawl to safety behind the counter. Rather than fleeing, Christopher followed his victim, walking around to the opposite side of the front counter with his gun still extended. The surveillance camera caught Christopher's movement behind the counter in the direction of the cash register. He was out of view for several seconds, crucial moments that witnesses would later describe as the longest of their lives. When Christopher came back into view, he was concealing his handgun under his shirt and walking calmly toward the exit. Christopher Young had just committed murder. Hasmukh Patel lay behind the counter with a gunshot wound to his chest, bleeding to death while his killer walked away without taking a single dollar from the register. This hadn't been a robbery gone wrong. This had been execution, pure and simple. Two of Patel's regular customers, Raul Vasquez Jr. and Hattie Helton, were in the parking lot when the shooting occurred. Vasquez had just pulled into a parking space in front of the store when he heard gunshots and looked up to see Christopher leaning over the counter, firing his weapon at Patel. When Christopher left the store and got into the small red car, Vasquez immediately called police and tried to follow him. He was able to tell dispatchers that the license plate began with W and that the perpetrator was wearing a black shirt and light-colored shorts. Hattie Helton had been checking scratch-off lottery tickets in her car when the alarm went off. She watched Christopher exit the store and get into the red Mazda parked by the gas pumps. Once he was gone, she ran into the store to check on Mr. Patel, then called 911 when she found him unresponsive behind the counter. Both witnesses would later identify Christopher Young as the shooter, their testimony corroborating the surveillance footage and physical evidence that would seal his death sentence. After murdering Hasmukh Patel, Christopher drove away in Daphne Edwards' stolen Mazda, his appetite for violence still unsatisfied. Instead of trying to escape or lay low, he used Daphne's money to pick up a prostitute and continue his drug binge. The callousness was breathtaking. Within an hour of committing sexual assault and murder, Christopher was seeking pleasure and chemical escape. For the next 2 hours, while police searched for him and Hasmukh Patel lay dying, Christopher Young partied. He used drugs with the prostitute, showed no signs of remorse or stress, and acted as if he had simply completed another routine day rather than destroyed multiple lives. At approximately 11 a.m., an officer spotted the red Mazda protege parked at a house several miles from the crime scene. The license plate began with W, exactly as witnesses had described. Christopher was still wearing the black shirt and light-colored shorts that had been captured on surveillance footage. When police arrested Christopher Young, he was sitting in the driver's seat of Daphne Edwards' stolen car, still high on crack cocaine, still drunk from the previous night's binge. His hands, his shirt, and the steering wheel all tested positive for gunshot residue. Most damning of all, Hasmukh Patel's blood was found on Christopher's sock. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The surveillance footage was crystal clear. The witness testimony was unshakable. Christopher Young had been caught red-handed, literally and figuratively. In the interrogation room, Christopher confessed immediately. He told detectives he didn't even remember firing the gun, claiming he was too drunk and high to recall the details of his crimes. But the evidence told a different story. This hadn't been a drug-fueled blackout. This had been a calculated rampage by a predator who knew exactly what he was doing. In the span of just over 2 hours, Christopher Young had sexually assaulted a mother in front of her 3 young daughters, stolen her car at gunpoint, driven to a convenience store, and murdered an innocent shopkeeper for no apparent reason. 3 crimes, multiple victims, and a trail of trauma that would affect dozens of lives for generations to come. Hasmukh Patel died at the hospital that afternoon, surrounded by his devastated family. Daphne Edwards and her daughters began a lifetime of therapy and healing that continues to this day. Christopher Young was booked into jail and charged with capital murder, setting in motion the legal proceedings that would ultimately lead him to death row. The morning of terror was over. The long journey toward justice was just beginning. The Bexar County District Attorney wasted no time. Within hours of Christopher Young's arrest, prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. The evidence was overwhelming, the crimes were heinous, and the community was demanding justice for Hasmukh Patel's murder and the Edwards family's trauma. Christopher Young's trial began in early 2006, nearly 2 years after his November morning of terror. The delay had given his defense team time to prepare, but it had also given the prosecution time to build an airtight case that would leave no doubt about Christopher's guilt or the appropriate punishment. The courtroom was packed every day of the trial. Hasmukh Patel's family sat in the front row, dignified in their grief, seeking justice for a husband and father who had died for no reason other than being in Christopher Young's path. Behind them sat Daphne Edwards, who had found the courage to testify about the most traumatic experience of her life. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They began with the surveillance footage from Patel's store, playing it multiple times for the jury. The video showed Christopher entering the store, asking about dry cleaning prices, then suddenly brandishing his weapon and demanding money. Most damning was the audio, which captured Christopher's cold, calculated threats before he fired the shots that ended Hasmukh Patel's life. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Prosecutor Maria Rodriguez told the court, "this defendant didn't just commit murder. He committed 3 separate heinous crimes in the span of 2 hours: sexual assault, armed robbery, capital murder. Each crime was calculated, deliberate, and utterly without justification. The physical evidence was overwhelming: gunshot residue on Christopher's hands and clothing, Hasmukh Patel's blood on his sock, his fingerprints inside Daphne Edwards' stolen car, DNA evidence linking him to the sexual assault. The murder weapon was never recovered, but ballistics experts testified that the bullets recovered from the scene were fired from the same type of silver revolver witnesses described. When Daphne Edwards took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Her testimony was heartbreaking and precise. She described every detail of Christopher's assault, his threats against her children, the terror in her daughter's eyes. She spoke of the lasting trauma, the nightmares, the way her children flinched whenever someone knocked on their door. "He didn't just hurt me," Daphne testified, her voice steady despite her tears. "He hurt my babies. He made them watch things no child should ever see. He stole their innocence and their sense of safety. That's something we'll never get back." The defense team, led by experienced capital defender James Murphy, faced an impossible task. The evidence was clear, the crimes were documented, and their client had confessed. Their only hope was to save Christopher's life by showing the jury the traumatic childhood that had shaped him into a killer. "Christopher Young is guilty," Murphy told the jury during opening statements. "We're not here to dispute that. We're here to ask you to consider the man behind these crimes. A boy who lost his father to violence at age 8. A child failed by every system that should have protected him. A young man whose brilliance was destroyed by trauma and neglect." The defense presented evidence of Christopher's musical gifts, his chess-playing ability, his high IQ scores from elementary school. Teachers testified that he had been one of the brightest students they'd ever encountered. Family members spoke about his kindness as a young child, his curiosity, his potential. But the prosecution was ready for this strategy. They called Chala Riley to testify about Christopher's pattern of domestic violence, his assaults on his pregnant girlfriend, his complete lack of remorse when confronted with his actions. They presented evidence of his juvenile criminal record, his gang membership, his escalating violence against women. "The defense wants you to feel sorry for Christopher Young because of his childhood," Prosecutor Rodriguez argued during closing statements. "But this courtroom is full of people who had difficult childhoods and didn't become rapists and murderers. Trauma doesn't excuse evil. Pain doesn't justify terrorizing innocent families." The trial's most powerful moment came when Hasmukh Patel's son, Amit, delivered his victim impact statement. Speaking in halting English, he described his father as a gentle man who had never hurt anyone, who had worked 16-hour days to support his family, who had been killed for absolutely no reason. "My father came to America for opportunity," Amit Patel said, his voice breaking with emotion. "He found death instead. Christopher Young didn't just kill my father. He killed our family's dreams. He killed our sense of safety. He killed our faith that good people can live in peace." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on all counts. Capital murder, aggravated sexual assault, aggravated kidnapping. The evidence had been so overwhelming that there was no real debate about Christopher's guilt. The punishment phase of the trial focused on a single question: should Christopher Young live or die? Texas law required the jury to answer 2 specific questions. Would Christopher be a future danger to society? Were his crimes so heinous that death was the appropriate punishment? The prosecution painted Christopher as an unrepentant predator who would always be dangerous. They highlighted his lack of remorse, his pattern of escalating violence, his complete disregard for human life. They argued that some crimes are so evil they demand the ultimate punishment. The defense made an emotional plea for life in prison without parole. They argued that Christopher was young, that people can change, that executing him would only create more victims, his own children, who would grow up knowing their father had been killed by the state. But the jury had heard enough. After just 2 hours of deliberation, they sentenced Christopher Young to death. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of sobs and applause as the judge formally imposed the death penalty. "Mr. Young," Judge Patricia Martinez said as she pronounced sentence, "you have been found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death by lethal injection. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court has none to give." Christopher Young was 22 years old when he was sentenced to die. He was transported to the Polunsky unit in Livingston, Texas, death row, where he would spend the next 13 years of his life in a 6 by 10-foot cell, waiting for the state to end his life. Death row changed Christopher Young, or at least that's what he claimed. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It took years of solitude, reflection, and what Christopher described as a spiritual awakening that fundamentally altered who he was as a person. The change began with books. Christopher had always been intelligent, but in prison he finally had time to apply that intelligence to understanding himself and the world around him. He read voraciously: philosophy, psychology, religion, literature. He earned his GED, then began working on college courses through correspondence programs. But the real transformation, according to Christopher, came through his relationship with fellow death row inmate Reginald Blanton. Reg, as he was known, had been on death row for several years when Christopher arrived. He had used his time to become a mentor to younger inmates, helping them find peace and purpose even in their desperate circumstances. "Reg showed me a different way to be," Christopher would later write in letters to supporters. "He showed me that even on death row you can choose to be something other than the worst thing you've ever done. You can choose to grow, to help others, to find meaning in meaningless circumstances." Reginald Blanton became Christopher's teacher, his spiritual guide, and his closest friend. He introduced Christopher to meditation, to philosophical texts that challenged him to think beyond his own pain and anger. Most importantly, he showed Christopher how to take responsibility for his actions without being destroyed by guilt. The two men would pass books back and forth under their cell doors, writing extensive notes to each other about philosophy, spirituality, and the possibility of redemption. Their friendship became one of the few bright spots in the harsh environment of death row. In 2009, Reginald Blanton was executed by the state of Texas. His death devastated Christopher, but it also strengthened his resolve to continue the work Reg had begun. Christopher became a mentor to other young inmates, helping them navigate the psychological challenges of life on death row. Guards and prison officials began to notice the change in Christopher Young. He became a calming presence during tense situations, talking down agitated inmates, helping to prevent violence before it started. He had no disciplinary infractions during his 13 years on death row, a remarkable record for someone in such a high-stress environment. Christopher developed a program he called Reaching Our Young from the Inside Out, designed to help at-risk youth understand the consequences of gang involvement and criminal behavior. He wrote letters to schools, youth programs, and community organizations, sharing his story as a cautionary tale. "I was a gifted child who made terrible choices," Christopher wrote in one of his letters. "I had musical talent, intellectual ability, and people who loved me. But I chose anger over healing, violence over responsibility, destruction over creation. Now I'm going to die for those choices. Don't follow my path." Christopher also became deeply religious during his time on death row. He studied the Bible intensively, participated in prison religious services, and corresponded with spiritual advisors from various denominations. His letters from this period show a man genuinely wrestling with questions of forgiveness, redemption, and what it means to find peace with an unforgivable past. "I can't undo what I did," Christopher wrote to a pen pal in 2015. "I can't bring Mr. Patel back to life. I can't erase the trauma I caused Daphne Edwards and her children. All I can do is try to become a better person than the monster who committed those crimes, and hope that somehow that means something." The transformation appeared genuine to many who observed Christopher during his years on death row. Prison chaplains spoke of his sincerity, his willingness to help others, his complete absence of the anger and violence that had defined his youth. Fellow inmates described him as a peacemaker, someone who could be counted on to diffuse conflicts and offer guidance to those struggling with their circumstances. But Christopher's supporters faced a fundamental problem. No matter how genuine his transformation, it couldn't undo the crimes he had committed. Texas law is clear that personal growth and rehabilitation don't erase capital murder. The state's position was simple. Christopher Young had been sentenced to death for his crimes, and that sentence would be carried out regardless of who he had become in prison. Christopher's legal appeals continued throughout his 13 years on death row, but each one was rejected by higher courts. His lawyers argued ineffective counsel, prosecutorial misconduct, racial bias in sentencing, all the standard appeals filed in capital cases. None succeeded. The most compelling argument his defense team made was statistical. They presented evidence showing that black defendants in Texas were significantly more likely to receive death sentences than white defendants who committed similar crimes. They pointed to cases where white offenders had committed equally heinous crimes but received life sentences instead of death. Most prominently, they referenced the case of Thomas Bartlett Whitaker, a white man who had orchestrated the murders of his entire family, his mother, his brother, and the attempted murder of his father. Whitaker's crimes were arguably worse than Christopher's, involving the calculated murder of multiple family members. Yet Whitaker had received clemency just 7 months before Christopher's scheduled execution. If Thomas Whitaker can be spared, why not Christopher Young? His lawyers argued in court filings. Both men committed terrible crimes. Both showed evidence of rehabilitation in prison. The only significant difference between them is the color of their skin. But Christopher's appeals were complicated by the nature of his crimes. The sexual assault of Daphne Edwards in front of her children, the calculated murder of Hasmukh Patel, the complete absence of remorse at the time of his arrest. These factors made it difficult for even death penalty opponents to argue for clemency. As 2018 approached and Christopher's appeals were exhausted, his supporters mounted a final campaign to save his life. They gathered character letters from prison staff, fellow inmates, and community members who had been touched by his transformation. They created social media campaigns highlighting his mentorship work and his genuine remorse for his crimes. But the families of Christopher's victims opposed clemency. They argued that his transformation, however genuine, didn't justify sparing his life. Hasmukh Patel would never get the chance to transform or grow or mentor anyone. He was dead because of Christopher Young's choices. He had 13 years to become a better person, Inmate Patel said in a statement opposing clemency. "My father didn't get 13 years. He got bullets in his chest and died on a store floor. Christopher Young's personal growth doesn't bring my father back." By mid-2018, it was clear that Christopher Young's appeals were exhausted and his execution was inevitable. He began preparing for death, writing final letters to his 3 daughters, his supporters, and the families of his victims. He spent his remaining time trying to ensure that his story would serve as a warning to other young people about the consequences of choosing violence. On July 16, 2018, Christopher Young's final appeal was denied. His execution was scheduled for 6 p.m. the following day. After 13 years on death row, his time was finally up, July 17, 2018. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles had spoken with unanimous finality. No commutation, no reprieve, no mercy. Christopher Young would die as scheduled at 6 p.m. that evening. The state of Texas had decided it must take its pound of flesh, and nothing, not his transformation, not his mentorship, not even the unprecedented step taken by his victim's family, would change that decision. In a remarkable act of forgiveness that few could understand, Hasmukh Patel's son Amit had actually asked the parole board to commute Christopher's sentence to life in prison without parole. The man whose father had been murdered in cold blood had written a letter explaining that executing Christopher would not bring his father back, and that life imprisonment would serve justice while allowing Christopher to continue his work mentoring young people. "My father was a man of peace," Amit Patel had written to the board. "He believed in redemption and second chances. While I cannot forgive Christopher Young for what he did, I believe my father would want his death to have meaning beyond vengeance. Let Christopher Young spend the rest of his life in prison, working to prevent other young people from making the choices that led to my father's murder." The letter was extraordinary, a victim's family member asking for mercy for their loved one's killer. But it wasn't enough. The board remained unmoved. Christopher Young had been sentenced to death for capital murder, and that sentence would be carried out regardless of forgiveness from the victim's family or transformation in prison. Now, on his final day, Christopher lay on his narrow bunk in cell 12, Block F, knowing that when the sun set that evening, he would be dead. The countdown he had lived with for 13 years was finally measured in hours instead of years, minutes instead of months. The morning brought visitors, people he loved who had come to say goodbye. The first was his mother, Patricia Young, the woman who had given him life and then watched helplessly as he threw it away. She was 54 years old now, graying and worn down by years of worry, shame, and heartbreak over what her brilliant little boy had become. Patricia had visited Christopher regularly throughout his 13 years on death row, never missing a birthday, never failing to tell him she loved him despite everything he had done. She had watched his transformation, celebrated his achievements in prison, and held on to hope that somehow his life might be spared. "Baby," she said to him through the reinforced glass that separated them, "I want you to know that I'm proud of the man you became in here. Not the boy who went in, but the man you became." Christopher pressed his palm against the glass, wishing he could hold his mother's hand one more time. "Mama, I'm sorry for everything I put you through, for hitting you when I was young, for the shame I brought on our family, for making you watch them kill your son." Patricia Young had forgiven her son years earlier, but hearing his apology still brought tears to her eyes. "You were sick, baby. Hurt and sick and angry at the world. But you got better. You found peace. That's what I'm holding on to." They talked for an hour about memories from his childhood, the music lessons she couldn't afford but somehow managed to pay for, the chess tournaments where he dominated opponents twice his age, the dreams they'd once shared of college scholarships and a better life. They carefully avoided talking about the crimes or the execution that was now just hours away. The hardest part of the visit came when Patricia had to leave. She stood up slowly, placed both hands on the glass, and looked at her son for what she knew would be the last time. "I'll see you again someday," she whispered. "I don't know where or when, but I'll see you again." "Yes, ma'am," Christopher replied, his voice steady despite his tears. "Tell everyone I said goodbye. Tell them I'm sorry. Tell them I tried to be better." After his mother left, Christopher was allowed a visit with his two daughters, now 17 and 13 years old. They were accompanied by their guardian, as their mother Chala had decided years earlier that she couldn't handle the trauma of watching their father be executed. The girls had grown up knowing their father only through prison visits and monitored phone calls. They had no memories of him as a free man, only as the inmate in the orange jumpsuit who told them he loved them through bulletproof glass. Despite everything, they loved him back with the uncomplicated devotion that children reserve for their parents. "Daddy, are you scared?" asked his younger daughter, her voice small and uncertain. Christopher chose his words carefully. These might be the last words his children ever heard from him, and he wanted them to matter. "No, baby girl, I'm not scared," he lied gently. "Daddy made some terrible mistakes when he was young, and now I have to pay for them. But I want you and your sister to promise me something. Promise me you'll never make the choices I made." Promise me you'll stay in school, stay away from gangs, stay away from drugs. Promise me you'll be better than I was." Both girls nodded solemnly, not fully understanding what their father had done but sensing the weight of his words. They talked about school, about their friends, about their dreams for the future. Christopher listened to every word, memorizing their voices, trying to preserve these final moments with his children. "I love you both more than you'll ever know," he told them as the visit came to an end. "When you think about me, don't think about the bad things you might hear. Think about how much I love you. Think about how proud I am of who you're becoming. And remember what I told you, be better than me." The girls were crying as they were led away, not fully comprehending that they would never see their father again. Christopher watched them go, his heart breaking for the pain his choices had caused them. They would grow up fatherless because of his actions, joining the ranks of Hasmukh Patel's children, who had also lost their father to his violence. As the afternoon wore on, Christopher met with his spiritual advisor, Reverend Marcus Johnson, who had counseled him for the past 5 years. They prayed together, read from Scripture, and talked about forgiveness, both asking for it and giving it. "Are you at peace?" Reverend Johnson asked. "As much as I can be," Christopher replied. "I know I can't undo what I did. I know Mr. Patel's family is still hurting, and Ms. Edwards and her daughters are still dealing with trauma I caused. I can't fix that. All I can do is face what's coming and hope that somehow my story helps prevent someone else from making the same mistakes." At 4 p.m., Christopher was moved to a holding cell near the execution chamber at the Huntsville unit, 45 miles south of his death row home. The transfer marked the beginning of the final phase of his life, the last 2 hours before the state of Texas would end his existence. Christopher spent those final hours writing letters to people who had supported him, thanking them for their kindness and asking them to continue working with young people to prevent others from following his path. He wrote a final letter to Daphne Edwards and her daughters, expressing his remorse and asking for their forgiveness, though he didn't expect to receive it. At 5:30 p.m., Christopher was offered his final meal, not a special request, but the standard prison fare of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, corn, and a slice of bread. He ate slowly, each bite bringing him closer to his final moments. The food tasted like cardboard, but he forced himself to finish it, not wanting to give the guards any additional worry about his condition. At 5:45 p.m., Christopher was escorted to the death chamber. The room was small and sterile, dominated by the gurney where he would spend his final moments. Witnesses had gathered behind one-way glass, reporters, prison officials, and representatives of both the victim's family and Christopher's supporters. As the guard strapped him to the gurney, Christopher remained calm and cooperative. He had spent 13 years preparing for this moment, and he was determined to face it with dignity. The IV lines were inserted into both arms, connected to the machines that would deliver the lethal cocktail of drugs designed to stop his heart. At 5:58 p.m., the warden asked Christopher if he had any final words. Christopher turned his head as far as the restraints would allow, looking toward the witness area where he knew people were watching. When he spoke, his voice was clear and steady. "I want to apologize to the Patel family for taking their father and husband away from them. Mr. Patel was a good man who didn't deserve what happened to him. I want to apologize to Daphne Edwards and her daughters for the trauma I caused them. I'm sorry for the pain I've brought to everyone affected by my crimes." Christopher paused, taking a breath before continuing. "I want my daughters to know that I love them, and I want them to learn from my mistakes. Don't choose anger. Don't choose violence. Choose to be better than I was." He looked up at the ceiling one final time. "I'm ready." At 6 p.m. exactly, the lethal injection began. The first drug, pentobarbital, was designed to render Christopher unconscious. The second drug, pancuronium bromide, would paralyze his muscles. The third drug, potassium chloride, would stop his heart. As the drugs entered his system, Christopher's eyes grew heavy. "It burns," he whispered, tears sliding from the corners of his eyes. Within moments, his breathing became shallow, then stopped altogether. At 6:17 p.m., after 17 minutes of chemical death, the prison physician checked Christopher's vital signs and nodded to the warden. "The condemned has been executed according to the laws of the state of Texas," the warden announced. "The time of death is 6:17 p.m. Christopher Anthony Young was dead at age 34, 13 years and 8 months after he committed the crimes that sealed his fate. The state of Texas had claimed its pound of flesh. Outside the prison, a small group of death penalty opponents held a vigil, their candles flickering in the humid evening air. They said prayers for Christopher, for his victims, and for a justice system they believed was fundamentally broken. Across town, Hasmukh Patel's family gathered at his gravesite, finally able to say that their father's killer had paid the ultimate price for his crimes. The execution of Christopher Young marked the end of a story that began with a gifted child who could play violin by ear and ended with a condemned man who died strapped to a gurney. It was a story of wasted potential, systemic failure, and the eternal question of whether redemption can ever be enough to overcome unforgivable acts. 3 families were forever changed by Christopher Young's choices: the Patels, who lost a beloved father and husband; the Edwards family, who survived trauma that would affect them for generations; and Christopher's own children, who joined the ranks of the fatherless. In the end, Christopher Young's life became a cautionary tale about the consequences of choosing violence over healing, anger over forgiveness, destruction over creation. His transformation in prison was real, but it came too late to save him from the ultimate penalty for his crimes. The last chapter of Christopher Young's life had been written. Justice, according to the state of Texas, had finally been served.